Timothy Ellam, King's Counsellor, is president of the International Amateur Radio Union, the IARU. This institution was created in Paris. The IARU has been the watchdog and spokesperson or advocate for the world amateur radio community since 1925. The IARU is a UN-recognised national NGO consisting of over 164 national amateur radio societies from around the world. It is governed by the IARU Administrative Council, and the AC consists of the IARU President, Vice President, Secretary, and 2 representatives from each of the 3 regional organisations. Professionally, Mr. Ellum is a barrister and with a major Canadian law firm working in both Canada and London. Tim has acted on a number of telecommunications matters and appeared for radio amateurs on antenna zoning matters before the Federal Court in Canada and on a number of development appeal boards. He is also the co-author of the Dispute Resolution in Telecommunications Sector, published by the ITU. We are grateful that he has employed his considerable legal expertise to the benefit of amateur radio and for his commitment to the IARU and its important work. Tim became a special advisor on legal matters to the IARU in 1999, and in 2001 he was elected to the IARU Region 2 Executive Committee and subsequently as IARU Vice President in 2004. And he then became president in 2009. Prior to working with the ITU, he served as a counsel in other executive positions to the Canadian IARU Member Society, Radio Amateurs of Canada. He holds a Canadian license. He's had this since 1977, Victor Echo 6 Hotel Sugar, and a British amateur radio license since 1978, Golf 4 Hotel Uniform Alpha. Yes, I always use sugar because it's easier. Mr. Ellum has represented the ITU at the IARU at a number of ITU meetings since 2001. So Tim, welcome to the 2022 RSGB convention. We are delighted that you've agreed to give our keynote presentation this year, and we are very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you, Stuart, and don't worry, everyone busts my call sign, especially on CW. Thank you, everyone. It's indeed an honor to be the keynote speaker at the RSGB convention. I've been a member for some time, and of course have held the UK call sign since 1978. I think 2022, it marks the first time since the pandemic started that we have been able to hold such meetings in person. I can't tell you what a joy it is being able to see people in person rather than on a screen. I'm always asked what is the best part of amateur radio. I think that's an easy answer. It is the people we talk to on the air, the people we rely on for mentoring, on technical matters, and the ability to socialize with some of the most interesting people you will meet. Indeed, I have made lifelong friends as a result of becoming an amateur radio operator in 1977. All of you being passion and dedication to this wonderful hobby, and for that I thank you. Now, there's always an inherent danger in inviting someone from the IARU to speak. We usually provide very dry and lengthy summaries of the ITU process that require countless PowerPoints to explain. I promise you I will try not to do that today. I want to talk to you about what I see are changes and challenges to the amateur service, how we must be ready for change, in some cases a major change in what we consider amateur radio to be, and how each of us can address the challenges that we face. And of course, the pandemic has been a challenge to amateur radio. What did we as radio amateurs learn from the pandemic? In my view, we learned quickly how to adapt. Much of the work IARU and its member societies do was transition to virtual platforms. We continue to represent the amateur interest, and amateur radio grew as individuals look for new ways to interact with each other. We support each other, as we always have. And I also think we learned to appreciate what a privilege it is to have access to a large amount of spectrum that we can use to connect with each other. Perhaps more than ever, During the times we were restricted to our homes, we truly appreciated what a broad range of activities we can enjoy on the air thanks in part to the numerous frequencies we have access to. Certainly the pandemic changed us and the way we interact with each other, but as amateurs we adapted and changed to continue to use the spectrum as we always have. Now those of you who've had the misfortune to hear me in the past know that I'm constantly saying that amateur radio has changed. I've said that IARU and its member societies must be ready to adapt and respond to that change. Well, I think we did that very well over the last 2 years. The world is changing at a frightening pace. Electric vehicles will be the norm. Petrol-powered cars will cease to be sold. Autonomous vehicles are going to be mainstream in a very short time. We are questioning the environmental impact of traveling and how what we do affects the environment. For many of the demographic in the audience, including myself, some of these changes may not be seen as for the better, but we will have to adapt. The same can be said for the amateur services. We are facing a generational and technical change in the amateur population. Such generational changes are not always reflected in our member societies or indeed the IARU. They may not be reflected by the people in this room. I invite you to consider a couple of points that I believe reflect how we as amateurs have been slow to change. Let us focus on what the amateur service is. And yes, this is a defined term in the international radio regulations. You will note it's the amateur service, not the amateur radio service. A radio communications service for the purpose of self-training, intercommunication, and technical investigations. Technical investigations. You can put a different definition of what that means, but to me it means we should be constantly advancing the art of communications and developing and embracing new technologies. It does not suggest, in my view, that we accept the status quo and be wedded to existing technology. We are a service that should be adapting to more efficient technology. We should be willing to change how we communicate and accept it as still amateur radio. We unfortunately sometimes are resistant to change and take far longer than we should in embracing new technology and concepts. Our history is replete with such examples. As long ago as 1948, ARRL heralded the ability to use single sideband in the amateur service. An editorial in QST called it the most significant development in amateur radio telephony. Here was one of our member societies heralding the use of SSB and encouraging its development. And if you look at the last sentence, and so immense are these advantages that we are convinced a speedy revolution in our equipment and our operating practices is imminent and certain. Well, certain for sure, imminent and speedy not so much. Despite the immense advantages that ARRL heralded in 1948, in 1954, some 6 years after this stunning editorial, you have an old timers club. Now, I love that old name, who had tried to lobby the FCC to remove sideband from existing phone subbands. In 1955, a letter to the editor of QST proposed standardizing different sidebands on various frequencies. I set this out here because I like what he calls ham radio's resistant constant, resistant to change. So here you have several years after QST had excitedly introduced sideband to amateurs, there are still people opposing its use. And magazines of this vintage are full of negative editorials about sideband. It took another decade at least before sideband was widely accepted. Change does not come easily to amateurs. While we are supposed to be carrying out technical innovations, and many are, we are very slow to take them up. To quote W4MXL, we indeed do have a resistance to change. And resistance to change, I like that term. Why would we as a group reject new technology that has so many benefits over AM modulation? Why does it take so long to accept what is new and embrace it as amateur radio? We have, after all, over the years, changed the ways in which we communicate. The amateur services are supposed to be at the forefront of technical change to enhance the art and science of communication. But when we are faced with new operating techniques that make effective use of the spectrum, we are slow to embrace them. We seem to have a mindset that what is amateur radio is what interests us, and heaven forbid that we should have some new technology encroach on what we enjoy. And you knew I was going to turn to this slide. One example of the technical changes in amateur radio is the popularity with FT8. However, a segment of us have been slow in adopting this new technology into the definition of amateur radio. Instead, we enter into endless debates as to whether FT8 is real amateur radio, and seem to forget that we've already moved beyond that debate, as FT8 is already one of the most popular modes used by new and existing amateurs. But you still hear people say it's not amateur radio, it's computers talking to computers. I had a discussion with a new amateur recently in my home club in Calgary. He lives in an apartment and has limited room for antennas. In fact, he uses an indoor loop antenna for HF. And because of that, he uses FT8. You should have seen the excitement he conveyed to me because he recently was able to work Botswana on FT8. He explained that is why he got into amateur radio, to be able to communicate with countries halfway around the world. He did not care if it was a sideband or a CW contact. He was enthused because he communicated with Botswana, and that he was excited that amateur radio, in whatever form, allowed him to do that. He was just as excited as I was when I was a new ham and working my first DX on CW. It was JA5DVK back in July 1977. I remember that excitement. No doubt many of you do as well. I was overjoyed when I received the QSL card. The other amateur was ecstatic that his contact was confirmed on LOTW. We need to recognize that enthusiasm and encourage it. New hams who are enthusiastic about amateur radio are the future. We, in turn, should be encouraging new technologies and new ideas rather than taking the position they are not real amateur radio. What many of us perceive as real amateur radio has changed. We collectively need to recognize that and be willing to embrace such changes. It is all amateur radio. Another example, QSL cards. Who does not love receiving them? The old adage, a QSL is the final courtesy of a QSO. I agree that we need to change what a QSL is. We continue to use paper QSL cards and rely heavily on the Bureau system. Given the changes in postal rates and the cost of bureaus to member societies, query if we'll still be able to utilize paper QSL cards in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time. During the pandemic, postal services stopped in many developing countries. There's a recent article in The Economist suggests Ecuador has a backlog of over 1 million letters and parcels. I know there are many other countries with the same issue. There are many countries with the postal services challenged, including in developed countries. And we all know the cost of post, along with many other things, has gone up in many countries. I personally do not believe the QSL Bureau system is sustainable. The expense of maintaining a bureau is simply prohibitive for many societies. And I do not mean to criticize in any way the many volunteers that work in the bureau system. It is a staggering amount of work, and they should be applauded for doing this. The work they do is just another way of amateurs giving back to the community, and I do urge everyone to support the Bureau. Consider, though, who is going to do that work in the future? My own provincial bureau languished for months before a volunteer could be found to take it on. There are, in some countries, major customs and excise problems that increase the cost of shipping QSL cards. And what about the environmental concerns that we are all faced with? Can we justify confirming radio contacts with paper cards and the cost of greenhouse emissions to send them around the world? Now, I get told, Tim, you're anti-QSL cards. I am not. Do not get me wrong. I love receiving paper QSL cards. I send them out for major operating events. I'm just as much to blame as anyone for burdening the Bureau system. But I am also aware that we may not be able to continue this activity in the future. Should we not be actively embracing changes to how we confirm QSOs and dealing with them now? There are several, as we know, online platforms that allow us to do that. And sure, they're not as romantic. If you want to use that word, perhaps as paper cards, but you are still credited with the contact. And I'm not saying we need to give up paper QSLs now. All I am saying is consider the future. It will not be cost efficient or environmentally friendly to send pieces of card around the world solely to confirm a contact. Now, I know this is a controversial topic. I know abandoning QSL cards is like sucking the life out of amateur radio for some of us. I understand. It is, in my view, a foregone conclusion that confirming contacts with paper will change. If not now, in 5 years' time, certainly. You know, a few years ago, I was asked to speak at my university's amateur radio club. And I was astounded when I showed up. The room was huge. Over 200 people, mainly engineering students, were in attendance. Wow! All these people here to listen to me talk about IARU. Now, the fact the club is well-funded and laid on free beer and pizza for all, I'm sure had nothing to do with it. And there were other speakers in attendance, and they talked about the usual things, DXing, contesting, exchanging QSL cards, etc. None of this got much attention. So after my talk, which I'm sure was the most riveting that evening, I asked the students what interested them about amateur radio. Here, in no particular order, is what they said. Drone control using amateur spectrum. I didn't know this, but amongst universities, especially in North America, they have contests for using drones and how far you can send them and that type of thing. Small satellites and practical application of academic studies to something that is hands-on. And this one I thought was surprising. It will look good on my CV in a competitive engineering market. People still think that. You will note they did not mention QSLing. That, in a nutshell, is the generational challenge we face. I've often said we should not be explaining amateur radio to younger people, but listening to what interests them, and then set out how amateur radio can help them achieve their interests. And on the last point, getting a license just for one CV, is that such a bad thing? The more talented people we can involve in the amateur service, the better. Having an appreciation of what we do as a graduate moves on in her career can only help us. Now, the amateur service is only as good as the spectrum we enjoy. Spectrum is our lifeblood. It is why RSGB and other member societies devote a significant amount of their budgets to defend what we have. It is the main work of IARU. And we have access to a tremendous amount of spectrum. We make full use of very little of it. And one statistic which always amazes me is that if you consider the primary and secondary allocations, we have access to some 9% of the spectrum between 144 megs and 275 gigahertz. 9%. In today's world, that is a massive amount of spectrum for a relatively small number of users. Now, I know many of you are active in the bands above 144 meg. Many are not. And we need to inspire new amateurs to use that spectrum, whether it be by digital modes or otherwise. We should be encouraging innovation rather than holding on to what many of us see were the glory days of ham radio. Those days are gone. We need to move forward. Now, why do I say that? It's no secret the bands we use are under constant threat. Our allocations in that portion of the spectrum are attractive targets to other users, and we need to work very hard to maintain our existing frequencies. In my day job, cases always turn on the evidence that one has to support a position. For some of our higher allocations, we lack evidence of use. Of more immediate concern, we can also no longer ignore the changing view by many regulators that spectrum must be shared where it is feasible, nor that the spectrum allocated to the amateur services, both HF and VHF+, is untouchable. For those of us who attend RTO and ITU meetings, we know that many of the delegates from country administrations are not the engineers of old. Indeed, many of those delegates used to be radio amateurs. That is not the case anymore. Delegates are being replaced by economists, and dare I say it, lawyers. They do not see the spectrum allocated to amateurs as having historical significance or that it can not be used by other services. That is a change we have to deal with, have had to deal with over the last several years. Our primary goal at any World Radio Conference is to retain our existing spectrum. For the most part, we have done that, and in some cases, added spectrum. I'm always told that if we want IARU to be more relevant to amateurs, we should do something dramatic. Add 200 kilohertz to 20 meters. Yes, if it was that easy. It is not. I can safely predict we will not have an expansion of our existing HF spectrum in our lifetimes, and maybe never. I can tell you, though, that there is very little appetite at ITU to give any spectrum user, including the amateur services, new primary allocations. Spectrum is looked at as a global resource that should be shared where feasible. Now, the IARU are excellent advocates at RTO and ITU meetings. You should all be justifiably proud of the work that our volunteers do in this space. They too have had to adapt to changes have done an excellent job. But our role as advocates for the amateur service is becoming increasingly difficult. We know that our secondary allocation at 23 centimeters is facing incredible pressure from the radio navigation satellite services, who are primary users in that part of the spectrum. The demand for interference-free RNSS services is largely driven by the changes in our society. Autonomous vehicles and other machines will make extensive use of that spectrum. The public demand for autonomous vehicles is high and will only continue to grow. IARU has been working with other services on this issue for 4 years. Consider the GNS industry pamphlet that was circulated at the last WRC. Look at some of the bullet points. Some amateur emissions can cause significant interference. Solving such interference can take days and be a burden on the administrations that will need to trace and resolve. Millions more RNSS receivers will use the band. Coexistence with RNSS. And sure, a lot of this is overstated. There have only been 2 cases of interference which were quickly resolved. This, though, is an example of how a motivated, well-funded industry is able to effectively lobby within the ITU process. That is not to say we do not respond to such submissions. We do strongly advocate for the amateur services, but we have to recognize we are secondary at 23 centimeters. This chart shows the issue, I think, in graphic detail. Barry Lewis, G4SGH, prepared this, and I think it shows quite clearly the Galileo, GLONASS, and Compass systems substantially overlap our 23 centimeter band plans. 10 years ago, autonomous vehicles and devices were not at the forefront of consumer interest. Well, they are now. Perceived consumer demand for products that use RNSS is here and will only increase in the future. Now, the IARU has and will work to minimize the constraints on amateur radio activities and continue to seek amendments to the draft recommendations through the ITU process. Our volunteers have done a fantastic job to date. But as a secondary user, radio amateurs should understand the need to protect the RNSS service in many consumer and industry applications like autonomous vehicles. And that may lead to some restrictions on our use of the 23 centimeter band. As a secondary user, we may have to change and adapt to how we use this allocation. That is a simple fact we may not be able to alter in any substantive way. However, we are radio amateurs. We adapt and change as necessary to meet challenges such as this. I'm sure we will in this case. If you have not already, I would encourage you to review the papers that we have submitted to ITU on this topic, which are readily available on the IARU website. How we represent amateur services at ITU has also changed. 20 years ago, the IARU team at a WRC was usually 6 people or less. At WRC 23, we needed 14 people. Yes, and some were not there for the entire time, and we had overlap with some individuals, but honestly, even with this number of hard-working volunteers, we were stretched to cover all the meetings, as Murray Neiman will attest. Several member societies, including RSGB, covered the expenses of some of our volunteers, for which we are most grateful. But I think this is just an example of the financial pressures we will face to properly cover IT meetings and WRCs in the future. We will need larger delegations, and we will need volunteers with a good grounding in spectrum regulation. Now, there's another striking feature of this picture. And no, it's not that we're a good-looking, photogenic group. I think it is obvious. We are hardly the most diverse crowd of chaps, and I suspect the average age of people in that photo is over 65. Try as we might, it is difficult to bring younger, more diverse volunteers into our midst to do the work and learn the ropes. And this must change. We need a new generation of leadership, if not now, certainly in the next few years. Many of the volunteers in this photograph have signaled their intention to retire after WRC 23. Who will replace them? How are we going to be able to afford expenses for that new group of volunteers? Travel is not getting any cheaper, and as we all know in recent times, travel is not for the faint of heart. In recent years, we have cut our expenses to the bone and severely restricted the number of ITU and RTO meetings we attend in order to conserve funds for the most important meetings. And while many meetings do offer a hybrid format, they are not ideal for our purposes. Much of what we do in advocating for the amateur services takes place outside formal meetings, with one-on-one meetings with other delegates. We need to do that. And while I can attest that IARU has a very restrictive expense policy, the vast majority of volunteers in this photo did not claim all of the expenses they might be entitled to. Remember, results at the ITU come from a consensus. We need to be there and on the ground. And ITU is also changing. I attended the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference last week in Bucharest. Why? Why did we spend some of our scarce resources to attend this meeting? Well, we did so primarily to ensure that we maintain our fee-exempt status and confirm there are no changes to the ITU Convention and Constitution that might affect our ability to participate in the work of the Union. We do not pay any fees to ITU to be members of the two bureaus, the Radio Communication Bureau and the Development Bureau. To put it bluntly, if we had to pay fees, we could not do our work. Fees are in the magnitude of multiples of 300,000 Swiss francs per sector per year. Other members pay reduced amounts, but certainly even a reduced fee would well exceed our yearly outlay. We have nowhere close to such amounts in our budget. We enjoy fee-exempt status by agreeing to participate fully and properly in the work of the ITU. Participation means more than sitting in meetings, but being an active member and contributing information papers when necessary. We attend and participate in all of the primary meetings in each bureau. Some of our team chair various working parties in the ITU. We also offer, as is required by the ITU, that they can participate in meetings of IARU, and they do. So there's no free lunch. We have to actively participate to have that fee exemption. And I'm pleased to say we have again been granted fee exemption for the next 4 years. And we've enjoyed that status since 1932. So when you hear about IARU attending meetings in some far-flung exotic locale, please remember why we are there. We have made a commitment to participate in ITU in return for not paying fees. We also have to be present. It is as simple as that. I might add in the photo, I'm the only one attending at IARU expense. John Seiveling, WB3ERA, was paid by ARRL, and he was on the US delegation. Serge Bertuzzo, VA3SB, was there for his employer on the Canadian delegation and not representing the amateur service, although he is an officer with Radio Amateurs of Canada. Another important reason for attending the Plenipot is to meet with candidates who are running for the elected posts in ITU. One novelty of this year's Plenipot is that the elections of the Secretary General made mainstream news. For whatever reason, this election was perceived as a fight over restrictions on digital growth, an open or restricted internet, East and West, good and evil. Now, in reality, both candidates for Secretary General, Doreen Bogdan-Martin from the United States and Rashid Ismailov from Russia, were both excellent candidates with fantastic credentials. In any case, media attention put the Plenipotentiary Conference in the limelight for at least this election. And I'm pleased to say the ITU elected its first female Secretary General, Doreen Bogdan-Martin. Doreen is also KD2JTX, only the third person who has held that post who has an amateur license. We have worked with the new Secretary General for many years, both when she held staff positions in ITU and as Director of the Development Sector. Now, I'll only add one thing for this photo. Doreen picked up that sign which was on our desk to hold it at her own volition. She didn't do that for anyone else. I think this is a wonderful appointment for leadership of the ITU and for diversity. Doreen is very skilled at working in the ITU process, and as The Economist noted, she is eminently qualified for the position. She will be a role model for the many women in ITC. In the 157-year history of ITU and its predecessors, ITU has only had one woman in senior leadership, and that is Doreen. Well, great. I can hear you say, we now have a ham at the helm of ITU, we have nothing to worry about, our spectrum needs will be answered and the existing spectrum will be safe from encroachment. No, that's not how it works. Certainly having a Secretary General who's a licensed amateur is very helpful, but does little to change the view of the regulators and others who might have a view of our spectrum. There are no votes in the ITU. Everything is done by consensus. Having senior leadership knowledgeable about amateur radio is very helpful, but not a definitive reason that amateur spectrum is safe. The Secretary General has a license. She knows amateur radio. She knows our spectrum allocations. Is she an active ham? Probably not, but it is on her CV, and she is proud of it. Not a bad thing at all. So when students tell you they want to get licensed just because it looks good on their CV, remember KD2JTX. So in summary, the world is changing at a rapid pace, and the amateur services need to embrace that change. Essentially, the world becomes used to IoT and autonomous vehicles and new and faster mobile devices that will need spectrum. We will not be able to stop this. The world evolves, and we have to as well. That means more challenges to spectrum we presently have access to, especially at 144 meg and above. Spectrum sharing will continue even for bands we think we own. Amateur spectrum is not set in stone. It will evolve. There will be no expansion of the present HF allocations in the next 10, 25, 50 years. I think I'm safe in saying that. I may be proven wrong. IARU and its member societies are in the right place at the right time. But how do we maintain this for the future? And that, to me, is the burning question. So the challenges I leave you with: where are the next generation of leaders? The status quo is not an option. We need to change, listen to new amateurs. What are they looking for? Embrace new technology, new ideas, new utilization of the spectrum. FT8 is amateur radio. Don't be that grumpy older amateur who pines for the good old days. Make the amateur services relevant. And what I mean by this is I detect an undercurrent in some circles that the amateur service has had its day. It certainly has not. We should think, though, when we operate, if what we are doing is seen as relevant to the person on the street. Spectrum sharing does not mean the sky is falling. We need to adapt to change. Operate and make use of what we have properly. Get on the air. Make use of our spectrum, especially above 144 meg. It is relatively easy now to scan segments of spectrum to detect utilization. I'm sure that has not escaped some of the other spectrum users. Let's give IARU the evidence we need. Also, chasing DX contests and some on-air discussions do not bring out the best in people. We should be cognizant of who might be listening to us. Support your member society. We could not do our work without the support of our 164 member societies. RSGB does wonderful spectrum work internationally, and we rely heavily on volunteers from your society for our work. Too many to mention. I mentioned Murray and Murray, but there are many more. I'm not sure why there appears to be universal reluctance by amateurs to join a member society. Please encourage amateurs to do so. And last, but certainly not least, have fun. I mean it. This should be a fun endeavor. We cannot sit around moping about spectrum challenges or what may be on the horizon. Let's get on the air. Thank you for listening to me. I hope it was not too much of a rant, but will give you some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We'll just try and squeeze in a couple of questions. We're slightly over time, but we'll take a couple of questions.
Hi, I'm Mike Naylor, G4CDF, primarily interested in VHF. One of the issues about spectrum is it's fine to have the spectrum, but what if you can't receive anything on the spectrum due to unauthorized spectrum users such as, any electronic equipment that's radiating?
Yeah, and that is another huge problem. I didn't touch on it, but it's something that we are dealing with. We have other experts like Martin from RSGB who are addressing that in various standardization bodies. But it's a huge issue as well.
Good morning to you. David Howlett, M0VTG. You mentioned funding, or at least you mentioned people claiming to attend these meetings. How is the IARU actually funded?
Well, thank you. That's a good question, and it's a sensitive one. Each IARU is broken up into 3 regions, and those regions collect dues from each of their member societies, and a portion of those dues go up to the IARU, what we call the International Secretariat, the main body. The other source of funding is from ARRL, who act as the Secretariat, and they provide roughly, depending on whether it's a WRC or not, between 60 to 70% of our funding. The rest of it comes through member societies like this, which is why it's critical that you get amateurs to belong to your society. And I can tell you, our budgets are pretty minimal. You know, I think this year we're kind of coming in well under $100,000 US dollars.
Okay, any last question?
Tim, Graham Murchie, G4 FSG. What you've said today is absolutely vital to the future. We all understand that. Or those of us in this room understand that. I'm not convinced your average radio amateur has the slightest idea. I'm not sure they understand anything or much of what the RSGB does, let alone the IARU. Can I ask you to consider, or seriously consider, doing an editorial for Radcom to try and get this message that you put across today to the wider community who aren't listening to us or watching us at the moment?
Well, I'm happy to, and I've done that for other organizations, but I think the big thing is this message, like you say, is you're all RSGB members, or at least I hope you are, and so you all understand what we're doing. But for many amateurs who are not members of the societies, it's a challenge, as you say, and I'm not exactly sure how we get that message across. It's difficult. Stuart?
Right, thank you.
There's
one more, is there more?
Yeah.
Beg your pardon?
Hi there, Craig Langman, M7LAN. As a new amateur and also an enthusiast into the IT arena, I also think that we need to help embrace bringing amateur radio and digital technologies together. With the launch of obviously Fusion, D-Star and DMR, there seems to be a bit of a sort of a pushback that that's not real radio. Mm-hmm. Yet to get a new generation, to bring in the leaders, we need to embrace that side of it. And I think through doing that, you'll get a lot more people coming into it.
Yeah, I fully agree. Like I said, don't be the grumpy old person in the room who doesn't want to shift technologies. And you saw how long it took for amateurs to move to sideband. Like, come on, we got new technology, we got people who are excited about it. Let's embrace it.
Thank you, Tim. I think we're sort of running a little behind because of our late start, so I'd like to draw to a close there and thank Tim for a very entertaining talk. Hello, we're at the RSGB convention and I'm lucky enough to be joined by 3 presidents today. So it's fantastic to be able to talk to these gentlemen. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Stuart Bryant, G3YSX, the RSGB president, and Larry McGriskin, EI9CN, the IRTS president, and also Tim Ellam, VE6SH and G4HUA, the IARU president and our keynote speaker at the convention this year. It's great to be back in person at a convention this year, but I wonder how radio amateurs are feeling about going to physical events in each of your regions.
Well, first off, I support what you say. It's great that we're back in person, and it's also great that we've allowed our colleagues who can't get here to join us by making this a hybrid event, as we promised last year. So that's great. If I look at wider events, my impression is that people are slowly emerging from their COVID hibernation. We've got a reasonable number of people here this time. It'll be interesting to see how many go to the Hamfest next weekend. In club meetings, my experience is it's a bit mixed. There are some people who are still hibernating for all kinds of good reasons. And there are others who are, have come out to enjoy the company. And one of the things we've done, by the way, is at our club anyway, is all our meetings are now hybrid. So those who can't, for any reason, work or concerned about COVID still, they can still join with their friends at the club meetings.
Really, our club members, I find, they come to the club meetings mainly for the camaraderie and the fun. And in that case, it's worked. Like yourselves, we operate in Zoom as well as a club meeting. So everybody gives us the best choice of everything that's available to us. So I think, all in the whole, amateurs are glad to be back in the club meetings again.
Yeah, I always say this hobby is all about the people you meet, the people that you get to know while you're operating or meeting in person. I think there has been a very big move, especially in North America, to come back to in-person meetings. But that's tempered with the fact that, given the demographic of the amateur population, many choose to participate now virtually, and most clubs have a virtual option. Certainly for outside events, I think I've seen a real uptick in things like fox hunting and field day, for example. There's been a real uptick in people attending those events.
And do you think this has changed the shape of clubs and groups, not just clubs, but groups as well, amateur radio groups and clubs? Do you think they're now different to they used to be?
Well, I think so, but I think the whole sort of structure is different from what it used to be. For example, the internet has become more of a core resource that helps us communicate and exchange ideas. I mean, if you go back, say 20 years even, right? The only way you could find stuff out was really go to a club meeting or buy a book or read a journal. But now the internet has become a sort of a key part. So I think it's a mixture.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think clubs have had to adapt, and they've had to change the way they do things. Remote operation, for example, I know my local club in Calgary has made great strides in making the club station available for remote operation. Again, a lot of the demographic has retired and maybe moved into a smaller facility where there's not enough room for antennas. So providing an outlet for them to contact and use the station remotely is really good, I think, for everyone.
And in our club, we worked it rather differently. We've concentrated more in the social atmosphere. We do give lectures for most classes, but we actually start our meeting off, a small group of us will go to dinner before the meeting. Others in the group go out for a breakfast morning. So we really value the social atmosphere that takes place in our club. And that's the most valuable thing. They help one another with antennas, with antenna parties. They help one another in every respect. It's just very nice to see this non-fragmented approach in any club.
So there is an organisation that meets somewhere near where Steve lives that, as I understand it, is just a breakfast party and not a formal club. There are other groups, like, for example, some email lists, I think have all the properties of clubs. So I think we need to fundamentally think about what it means for a club or a club-like entity in 2022.
Yeah, I think that's right, Stuart. I mean, there are a lot of people that just get together to socialize and maybe get together to do a specific operating activity. They're not structured, they don't have a constitution or take minutes, but they're just as much a club as any other organization.
I haven't experienced such a club. Ours does have a constitution and a good one. I can't say anything about it, but I really enjoy our club. I enjoy meeting the lads. We have good fun, and that's the key part of it. We enjoy one another. We encourage people to join us, particularly youngsters, if we can get them in. It's the hardest part.
So I'd like to change direction a little bit if I can, and talk about spectrum challenges. So Tim, I wonder if you could outline some of the challenges that you think exist to amateur radio at the moment.
Yeah, I think the issues that we have with respect to spectrum and how we deal with some of those threats has changed. A lot of the people that go to ITU or RTO meetings are no longer engineers or even amateurs. You used to see a lot of people that were amateurs, but they tend to be lawyers and economists and have different priorities. And I think the whole concept of having bands, fixed bands, which no one's going to trespass on, that's long gone. You're going to see more and more calls for spectrum sharing, even on frequencies where we're primary.
And I think actually we need to be more dynamic ourselves with our band plans. I mean, the very fixed structure we have at the moment, I'm not convinced that's what we need in the future. I think we need a far more dynamic structure. And indeed, we tried to discuss. We sort of started to discuss this in terms of contests, but I think we've got a long way before we get there. But if there is a peak demand for one type of activity, I don't see why we can't share and share alike amongst the different groups.
Yeah.
When amateur radio started, we all operated effectively what was a medium wave band until amateurs discovered the spark gap transmitter, and they moved from that. And of course, no sooner had they done it that the forces, the governments took over and told the amateurs, move up to shortwave. Nobody can possibly make use of it up there. And once again, the amateurs demonstrated to the world that they could contact the world, and eventually they were thrown off that band at those areas as well. And we were then in 1949 granted the bands we have, and I would firmly hold on to those bands.
No, I think that's right. Obviously, that's where our efforts should lie, but there are going to be pressures to coexist maybe with other services more than we're doing now, especially on the upper spectrum where we're not using it as much as we could.
And there's a resurgence in demand for the lower spectrum as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
So people have now consider satellites to be a very vulnerable primary communications means. And so with some of the new technology, some of the new modes that are being developed, the new professional modes, we're seeing a push back for the professionals to want large blocks of spectrum to do data linking and those sorts of services in HF.
Yeah, that's possible too. This French proposal that's there, this French spectrum regulators are supporting an application, if I understand it correctly, by a telecommunications company to effectively take over the entire 2-meter band. Have I got that wrong?
Well, I think there was some suggestion that that's what they'd like to do, but again, it was under the concept of spectrum sharing. We do not make as much use of the 2-meter band as we do, and if there's available times and spectrum that can be shared, that's going to be pressure on us. I think the whole sense of regulators now is they don't look at defined segments of the spectrum, but they say that we got all this spectrum here, who's using it? Let's see if we can divide it up by time instead of by use.
We do have one particular vulnerability though, and that's all the weak signal work we do means that some forms of sharing don't really work. A share at the same time doesn't work as well as, for example, you can have it Monday and we'll have it Tuesday.
No, that's right, and that's something that I think the people who go on behalf of IARU and other societies, like both of yours, to ITU and RTO meetings have to make clear that there are specific segments of a band which would not lend themselves to sharing. Perhaps others would.
And how do you see the importance of the national societies and then working with the IARU on some of those threats?
We couldn't do the work that we do, Steve, without our member societies. We have 164 of them. 2 excellent societies, IRTS and RSGB, lend volunteers to us to do that work. And I cannot put enough emphasis on amateurs joining their member society. I don't think we showcase enough the type of work that our volunteers do and how much of a benefit it is to members.
The most fundamental asset that we have is our spectrum, right? If there was no spectrum, there'd be no amateur radio. And it's these national societies working together and providing resources to defend the spectrum against some very well-heeled, very highly motivated predators who would like this spectrum that we occupy. Joining your national society is really important to help protect the fundamental of amateur radio, which is spectrum.
But the societies then take it a step further. They're responsible for ensuring that the amateurs are represented in international and national fora. And really, we have to support our societies in every way we can.
I always find it surprising as well that other organizations, pleasure boaters, even the NRA in the US, to use an extreme example, they have no difficulty getting members. And people flock to join them because they recognize the value that being a member of those type of organizations has on the enjoyment that they do, whether it's boating or something else. But there seems to be a real difficulty getting amateurs to join national societies, and I know it's shared across the board, and that's something I never understand.
And yet, if I look at it in a different aspect, I fly model airplanes as one of my other hobbies, and there was a major threat to the freedom to fly model aircraft in this country, and it was the National Society, with the help of its members, that pushed through a significant sort of liberalisation of the really quite strict rules that were originally planned. So, working together, we can influence the regulators.
That's right.
And they do that very well, I believe, and have done it since the early days of amateur radio.
Yes.
In recent years, we've seen a good uptick in membership, haven't we, Stuart, within the RSGB, with newcomers coming in over the last 2 years or so, and membership has grown really nicely. But I think it's important to try and keep those people and to let them know about all of the international work that's done on their behalf by all of the national societies. As Tim told us how many there were in the world, I think. How many was it?
Right now, 164.
There we go. All of those societies get together through the IARU.
But the important thing, the way we got that large growth was to think outside the box.
Yeah.
We had an emergency, which was COVID, and we completely rethought how we were going to do our exam system. And I think this applies to many other aspects of amateur radio. We can't be bound by how we used to do it. We've got to do what's right for the future.
Okay, I'm sure these discussions are going to continue, but I'd really just like to thank Stuart and Larry and Tim for joining us here today.